Christians have no problem being political on the safe issues. Okay, well, let's make sure we're not being total hypocrites here. If you're happy to be political there, you should be political here too. I think there's a lot of people who are orthodox, they'll give all the right answers, they'll tick all the right boxes, but will adamantly refuse to apply it to anything that's happening of note in the wider world.
Hi everyone, thanks again for tuning in to another episode of the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About. I'm here this week for my first interview back in my homeland of Northern Ireland, so it's good to be back, and as always joined by a very special guest. So Jamie, I'll let you introduce yourself. Thanks for joining us today, and just let's tell people what you're all about and how they can find you online and what you've been doing.
Yeah, I'm looking for the special guest, but there you go. It's just me instead. So my name's Jamie. I am an associate pastor at a church called Hope down in Craigavon, which is about 35 minutes outside of Belfast. I also run a YouTube channel under my own name and post on Twitter/X. Awesome. Occasional spicy tweets are available. Yeah.
Well, I first found out about your page through Matt Frad.
Right, yeah.
So Matt was, I've loved his page for a while. Obviously, very different theology. Like, I'm not Catholic, just put the disclaimer out there. This isn't a Catholic channel from here on out, but
everyone has to make that. I have to make that disclaimer as well. I'm really Protestant. I really
he put
am.
For you on the thing. He said my favorite Protestant pastor.
Yeah.
And I was like, he has a favorite Protestant pastor, or he likes a Protestant pastor. That's big news in my mind anyway. But because it seems like all the guys he has on are like Protestants that have turned Catholic.
He's had
or
a few
gone over
like
the
that.
years,
Yeah, he's had a few that haven't as well.
Really?
He's had, he has. But anyway, sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No,
but yeah.
So he's that's where I first found your page,
Right,
and then it was actually only last week, a week before when I reached out because I hadn't seen your channel, which is weird thinking you're from here. I think it's a small Christian scene in Northern Ireland where everyone does seem to know everyone, but somehow I hadn't come across you yet, and saw some like interesting content. So what kind of stuff do you normally post about then if you were to advertise your channel?
Sure, yeah. So I like interacting with culture. I probably lean slightly that way in terms of I'd say about half the content, maybe fractionally more, is cultural engagement from a Christian perspective, which I think is very needed, and I think there was a voice needed here for that as well, and it was something I was passionate about doing for a long time. So I lean that way, but I don't want to be exclusively that either, so sometimes go a wee bit broader. I come from similar to yourself, as we were talking before, so I'd be continuationist, so a little bit on gifts of spirit and stuff like that, a little bit of if something's interesting, do a little bit of just more general theology, but with that sort of cultural emphasis being part of it. Yeah.
Well, that's what's interesting from an outsider, like who's never heard of the Northern Irish Christian scene or like even culture. We're very unique in that we're like steeped in Christianity in some ways, but it's cultural Christianity, cultural Protestantism, cultural Catholicism, and then it's like we're all very familiar. We've all gone to church. Pretty much everybody says that they go to a church or they believe in a God or whatever. They kind of have that cultural Christian reference, but it's very unique to other parts of the world where I think it's like steeped in identity, maybe more than others. Because in America, everyone says they're Christian as well, but it's like here we go a bit further and we're like, I'm Protestant, or this is my church. Even if you never go, you never darken the door of the church. They're like, I'm a Presbyterian, I'm Church of Ireland, or this, that. Here's my chapel, here's where I was confirmed, and it's very unique sort of.
We have a lot of CEOs, as I would say, like Christmas and Easter onlys. That's a thing, right?
I haven't heard that one.
But at the same time, I do think so. One of my things at the minute, I was actually I'm working on a book with a guy on it. Is that I do think cultural Christianity is not. I think it's perceived to be more negative than it is actually.
Right. Okay.
I think there's an advantage to a culture that is Christianized. I think there's significant advantage. There are some downsides. It's not universally
like a Christendom kind of concept.
It's not a bad thing. I think it does a lot of preparatory work for evangelism. And I think it can often be a tool for evangelism. So, for instance, like recently we've had some interesting stuff where like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, former Muslim, became part of the sort of atheist movement. Was converted to Christianity, and part of her real reasoning for that was the cultural influence of Christianity. I think a lot of people are seeing that. Even Richard Dawkins the other day.
I noticed that. He said he's like
he's
cultural
a Christian, which is a warmth that he has never expressed towards Christianity until he goes, oh, well, seeing this disappear. Yeah. So I think Northern Ireland's got. I think I hold that as an advantage in Northern Ireland, but not an exclusive positive. Yeah. We do have much higher like actual church attendance here is way higher than say England or Scotland would be, and so I think that whilst we do have a lot of that cultural Christianity, we also do have some quite a lot of genuine Christianity
like
with that
faith,
mix that.
Yeah, it's I know, again, to talk about Matt Fradd, I think he's mentioned it a few times in his podcast, this concept of when there's an enemy at the gate, warring brothers reconcile, and that's probably what's going on a bit with Dawkins. And even, I mean, I think obviously Jordan Peterson has his own view on faith and things, which is interesting, but I think the other day he might have just got like baptized or something.
His wife became a Catholic, and he has...
Or taking communion or something.
Yeah, he was at a service with her. I don't know. I still think he's going to be a hard guy to get over the line, but he's going to be dragged kicking and screaming. But it is interesting how there's been a number of those really high profile people starting to move. Russell Brand is another one. There's a guy Jeremy he's got a YouTube channel called The Quartering. That's a big YouTube channel, and he's like started reading the Bible. He's like, the world's so messed up, I'm going to start reading the Bible.
Go to the safety of that.
So there's a lot of that going on actually, which I think's encouraged. I actually posted on Twitter last night. Like, I think we might be on the edge of something like what I'm calling like a normie revival. like
trad revival.
Yeah,
maybe.
well, like where there's something of like people that recognize that the world has gone nuts and they're not on board with the progressive agenda.
Correct.
And they recognize that this is wrong, and they're going, right, well, what's the solution?
Right, let's wind it back a few steps to where we had a trustworthy reference or frame of reference for how to view the world. And it's, we've kind of degenerated so far. And I think a lot of that is, it's almost like Christianity was a victim of its own success with the values that Christianity promotes, even things like... to an extent, things like freedom of expression could be seen as a value that's promoted by Christianity because we're one of the only religions that doesn't coerce people into believing, whereas in Muslim countries or something like that, you would basically be forced to be part of it, or else you're shunned from society or punished or whatever. So it's things like that where, and again, I've talked to people about this, about the American Revolution being like an interesting example of how it's like that was Christianity taken to the extent where they tried to, I suppose, form a country based on these values. And you can see some of the positives and some of the negatives of how society develops when you kind of let the values kind of just have their way without really without being set as a kind of dictated framework or a dictated way of doing things. Because it's like it's a cultural Christian country, or at least it was with Christian values, but people are effectively left to do what they want. So it's like you get to see how when you leave sort of Christian values open and let people do what they want, it actually kind of shows how people choose to do things that are self-gratifying. And
there's a guy, Glenn Sunshine, he's well-known like church historian, has a good podcast, or is part of a good podcast, and he's framed it this way. He said, wokeness is a Christian heresy. Like it borrows truths from Christianity, and obviously leaves out then a lot of essential truths and perverts the truths. But it is nonetheless it is something that has come out from a Christian frame of reference. Yeah,
I've never heard that, but that's a good way of putting it, because it's like you said, it's values that are. It's a perversion of values where you go too far one way.
Yeah. I would argue going too far is almost. I don't think
going back.
Yeah, it's you pervert them, you damage them, and you think that you're going too far. You think you're pushing them. Actually, what you're doing is you're not holding to the values at all. Ultimately, in the end, but nonetheless,
picking and choosing.
You're doing it. You're doing one, but you're setting that over and against the other things, which means that it doesn't become so. For instance, if you talk about love without holiness or something, well, true love it requires holiness,
and that's where like the idea of God is love. That is such a weird phrase, because it's, I know people say God is love, but love is not God, because God defines love. Love doesn't define God. And when people say even things like a Christ-centered kind of hermeneutic of reading the Bible, people try to say, well, let's read the Old Testament through the lens of what we believe Jesus to be in our own interpretation of Jesus, and then you see how they kind of take this concept of like where Jesus is really Gandhi or something.
Jesus is a hippie,
right?
He's
That's
long-haired, peace and love man.
And reinterpret the whole Old Testament through
Right,
this idea of like, well, we know that a loving person is, okay, Gandhi or Mandela, which is a weird one to me, or something like that. And they take like these people who they think are holy people. Well, Jesus is a part of that club.
Right.
Let's reinterpret, all the things that go in the Old Testament through that.
Absolutely, yeah, that's big. It's a big issue. So yeah, you get. I mean, there's only parts of Jesus that they actually like and listen to.
Yeah.
Certainly, nothing Jesus says in Revelation,
No.
is particularly held in high esteem.
No.
Stuff like, I've not come to abolish the law, not one jot or tittle shall pass away. They maybe hold to that so much.
Part of it.
Yeah, kind of a lot of the important stuff he said. It's the cherry picking, which is a real problem. Yeah.
So if we think, back to your kind of video where you addressed Russell Brand.
Yeah.
That was kind of out of this idea of like trying to advise someone how to choose a church or look for what the essentials are maybe in a church. Would that be fair to say? Like the things that people should be saying, like this is a faithful church and maybe this sort isn't. So if you look at the church these days, so what things do you think, first of all, we're doing well, like as a body? Is there anything you would say like we're doing quite well at this, as opposed to, we'll come on to the negatives, but what would you say, like we're doing this right and it seems like, we need to hold to this more?
Sure.
So I want to start with that, because we always start with like, what are we doing wrong? So it's an interesting sort of thing to think about.
What are we doing well? That's a good question. I think obviously it depends a bit on context, right? I do think there's something really good happening in terms of prayer in the church. I think that whilst I have theological disagreements with various things like the 24/7 prayer movement, I think are really encouraging. I think it's great that people are committing to serious, regular intercession. I think that's really exciting. I would also say that. So we're both coming from a continuationist perspective here, but the discovery is such a bad. That's definitely the wrong term.
Yeah.
The recovery of a prevalence of the gifts of the Spirit in the body of Christ at large has been a very good thing. If you look at the stats, so particularly when you look internationally, actually. Something like 80 to 90% of conversions in Nepal and similar in China, where we're talking a massive revival in China, are connected to a healing miracle. That is something that the church is now starting to expect can happen at the very least, and possibly should happen.
Even more cautious churches, I think, are dipping their toes in more.
Yeah, I hear a lot of stuff from cessationists that basically have a charismatic experience but put different language on it.
Right.
And I think it's important to get the language right, because I think if you don't, then you don't do things like eagerly desire these spiritual gifts. You're open, but are you pursuing? Right. But nonetheless, those are a couple of things where I go, I'm really encouraged about that, and I think those are great, and of course the growth of the body of Christ then, so connected to internationally, the growth of the body of Christ in what would have been called anyway the third world, the developing world, so Africa, Asia, South America, is really, really exciting, and so whilst we have particular issues in the Western church where we do seem to see something of a decline. Whether that is a terminal decline, I don't believe it is. I don't think it needs to be. I think that requires something on our part. But nonetheless, the fact that the kingdom of God is advancing in really dark places, formerly really dark places, and that light of the gospel is growing. We've got massive churches in places that would never have had any real presence of Christianity at any scale 100 years ago. Is just an exciting time to be alive and great to see. So
would you consider, whenever we look at these kind of more Christianity making inroads into popular culture more in fresher ways, like with these kind of influencers out there, could that be considered a positive, would you say? Like this idea that it's kind of making a bit of a revival in terms of Western popular culture? Yeah,
I think there's something that's happened a wee bit in that regard. Now, I don't know. I think if you look at the macro trends, you'd probably say that Christianity's got less.
Right, on the whole.
But I do think there's a slight recent uptick that I'm seeing.
Or it's getting like to be viewed as more acceptable or cool almost in a way.
There's certainly like a countercultural, like, that person's a Christian and they're kind of not ashamed of it, and that has with it now some social credibility that perhaps it didn't have, at least among some people. There's definitely, I mean, Justin Brierley, who does the Unbelievable show, which is part of Premier Christian Radio, isn't it? He's written a book, which I haven't read, but I've read an article on the book, so I'll give you the gist. Talking about basically the surprising rebirth of Christianity. And he noticed something in it, which I've noticed, and I was looking at the stats on this, that the younger Gen Z males are getting more religious than they were, and more Christian in that. I think the fastest growing sector of society in Finland, which is a really random example, but it's the one he had stats on, was men aged 18 to 29. And I think there is something happening where particularly guys, so I mean, I'm kind of the opinion that guys have been very much maligned in a lot of the recent sort of feminist world that we've been in. Yeah. So guys are starting to go, well, we've got to find a solution here, and they are becoming significantly more open to Christianity. So so I think there's a slight turning around that's happening there, and so I think you see what you're talking about amongst people that maybe guys are drawn to. So the likes of, say, a Jordan Peterson, a Douglas Murray, a Joe Rogan. These guys have no. I don't consider any of them to be Christians.
No, at least not of yet. Hopefully, someday.
Not yet. Yeah, one day. I think they're good thinkers, but they have a warmth and an openness to Christianity, and they are certainly creating a little bit of space for Christian voices that they weren't perhaps before. There's something that's happening there. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I hope they get there someday, but I think it's still at the stage where a lot of those guys, especially Jordan Peterson, are taking some of the what they see as the positives of Christianity. But have you ever seen the George Janko podcast?
No, was that the one? I know who he is.
Yeah, he did one with Logan Paul's show, and then he did one with Jordan Peterson.
Someone sent it. I haven't watched it.
He kind of held his feet to the fire a little bit, where he sort of pushed him and was like, it was from the perspective of, he did it from the perspective of Jordan Peterson being a Christian, so he kind of treated him like he was, because I think Jordan Peterson says he believes in God and he believes in Christ in the Richard Rohr sense of Christ, perhaps. Sure, so Janko treated him like he was a Christian basically throughout the interview, but he was asking questions like, who is Jesus to you, and how do you believe that he is the only way to the Father? Like, he was asking them these kind of questions, and it was interesting to hear him wrestle with questions that he maybe hadn't been asked before, and I was kind of hoping he would give him a hard time with it, but that it's like trying to push him just to say, like, to take the next step, saying like, not only is Jesus the way to like a wise or a prosperous life or whatever, but he's the way, you know, and that's the bridge we kind of need to cross with a lot of these folks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it was something I did put in that Russell Brand video. Maybe you wanted to ask a question specifically about that, but I'll go there now anyway. Which is the C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis has this brilliant quote. I don't know it all, but it's this long passage where he talks about basically, you can't view Jesus as merely a good teacher,
right? Yep.
Because he made all these outrageous claims. So either he's a complete liar. And his followers, by the way, would have to be complete liars, because they're all claiming to have seen him raised from the dead and all this stuff.
For people without believing it.
Right, yeah. And they're claiming to have seen him raised from the dead. So either they're telling lies, and so that would cancel out the entirety of the New Testament as being any source of truth if he's a liar or a lunatic and they're all mad, or he's God in the flesh. And who literally died and literally rose again, and that is the dividing line. That's a really important dividing line. So that's where I would want to push those guys in, and I think it's good when people do that, because you can't have a philosophical Jesus or a purely like Jesus. There's a lot
not
in
just a good teacher.
You can't just have that. You either have to go the whole way or you have to reject it all. And so it's good to see that. I don't know if George Janko did that. Sounds like he did a bit to some extent.
He did. He kind of did just kind of push him a little more than I've
Yeah.
heard him being pushed. But it was interesting to see it. Like, I'm kind of the opinion that it's not a bad thing to treat people, if they make a claim to believe in some way, then treat them like it's credible. Because this is actually one of the things that inspired me to start the podcast, where it started, I think, when someone said how Donald Trump is not a Christian, right? And I sort of took that and thought about it and was like, yes, we can weigh up someone's works and, you know, make a judgment on that. But to come out and say you're not or he is not a Christian, it was not a line that I was willing to cross, because, you know, there's things I like about him, things I don't like about him, and these days more probably dislike than like. So I was like, you know, I can see why, you know, from his fruits, it doesn't look like he's got a particularly vibrant faith. But how much more constructive is it to treat someone or take that claim at face value, and then what you're doing is you're not really following the conversion handbook, you're following the discipleship handbook, which is kind of a different way of doing things.
It's certainly an interesting angle. I suppose there's limits, because I do think at some point it's valid to say that that person's not a meaningful Christian, right? And so,
right,
you know,
living it.
Like, you know, if you've got, you know, some sort of pro-abortion, you know, like with Joe Biden recently, you know, he's claiming to be a Christian. I just can't, like,
Yeah.
but
Well, he should really be excommunicated if
he should be,
if he's a
absolutely.
Catholic.
Yeah, he should be. No, that was if the Catholic Church had a spine, that's what they'd do.
Or a Pope with a spine.
If the Pope had a spine, that's
Sorry,
right.
Matt
No,
Fradd, if you end up watching this.
Yes, sorry, Matt Fradd. If you were Pope, you would excommunicate him.
He might agree, I think. Like,
he would.
From what
yeah,
I've
yeah.
seen, but
Yeah.
he might not say it out loud.
Oh, I'm pretty sure he would. So I think it's okay. It is okay to be able to go, well, there are some lines here, but I think you're making a good point of, like, this person's making a claim, right?
Yeah.
Can we analyze that claim, and can we
Yeah.
go, right? Well, if you want that, if you're
Right, if you claim this.
if you're claiming this, then here's what the Bible actually calls you to believe or do, or whatever it might be, you know. And I think that's actually a really useful angle on the conversation, as opposed to maybe rehashing talking points that they've heard before.
I think also, interestingly, if you treat someone like they're within the fold, you can actually bring much more robust discipline on that person, perhaps. Because the thing is, if someone's a false teacher, or like they're kind of a snake, or is trying to deceive the church, right, from within, then that is treated sort of very differently to someone who's just an unbeliever. To the like, it's almost like the firmer rebukes and discipline are brought on the people who are claiming to be part of the body,
Right.
rather than the people who are just kind of to be left to one side. And it's almost like, I just sort of felt like, this could be a personal opinion, that maybe not the right one, but I was like, I was just thinking that if you, like, let's say Donald Trump is surrounding himself with Christians all the time, even if it's for personal political gain, then just the fact that he's surrounding himself with these people and claiming that he's one of them, perhaps eventually it will sort of seep into his personal being. Like, if you say it long enough, he might start to believe it. Versus if he sees Christians sort of universally rejecting him, perhaps might send it a different way. So it's just more of a personal preference. But that's inspired me to have these conversations, you know, where I was like, let's not necessarily make judgments, but let's talk about what it means to analyze, you know, someone's personal Christian walk, or like how do we know if someone's telling the truth, or how do we know if someone's really walking the way a Christian should? So it's, you know, it's just an interesting kind of way to look at things, or a different way of like discipling versus converting, and how do you treat someone like that. So that's, you know, positives. We've talked about positive things. Let's talk about some of the things where the at least the Western church needs to improve on. So going into the 21st century, you said Gen Z. I'm used to saying Gen Z, being from American translation.
I can't do it.
I know,
good conscience.
Because people always say, like, they think my accent's sort of slowly shifting, especially when I interview people that are American.
Right, yeah.
But it's only because, like, I said to someone one time, I was saying the word brain freeze, and they had no understanding of what the word brain was, at least in our accent. So I'd say brain freeze, and like really...
I have to do that with my own name. So I say Jamie, and they're like, Jimmy? I'm like, no, Jamie. So,
we have a lot of names, at least in Florida, that are like start with Ray or K. Right. Or like, so I always want to say like instead of Kaylee, it's Kaylee. Like, you know, like Achilles. And so I always say like Kaylee, or like names like that are, you have to really go for the A's. Anyway, that's beside the point. But
the audience will love this bit of the conversation. It's really Northern Irish.
Two Northern Irish fellas talking about
chat.
So it's if you want to comment below words that you want to hear us pronounce, you know, in the next time.
Brown cow.
Now brown cow, brain freeze. I'm trying to think of any other examples.
Tile.
And mirror.
Yep.
It's comment if you know what that word means, or if you want to guess what that word is, put it below. Anyway, so then let's look at the negative. So what going into Gen Z, we obviously. No, I was going to say we have to rethink things, but maybe we don't. So how would you think the church should approach this new woke or like more PC generation?
Yeah. So when it comes to the church and I suppose what the challenges are, obviously there's a fundamental, like, scripture doesn't change, right? So our, like, there's a lot. If I look at the wider church and I sort of go, well, what's going on and what are my issues with it? One of what I consider the big issues to be is I think there's a lot of people who are orthodox, and who believe, like, if you ask what they believe about scripture, they'll give all the right answers, they'll tick all the right boxes, and do it very well, actually, but will adamantly refuse to apply it to anything that's happening of note in the wider world.
Okay.
So that's where my real problem comes with a lot of what I'm seeing. So I give the analogy of like, if you have imagine you've got the perfect sniper rifle, right? And it's perfectly calibrated, and it's the best one possible, and it never jams, whatever. But you refuse to fire it at any live target when you're under attack. Yeah. That's how I view what a lot of the church is doing. So I see people and I go, what you're saying is right. Yeah. It's also not the issue at hand, or you're refusing to address the issue.
Scripture is a weapon. It's talked about in that
sword of the
terminology.
Sword of the Spirit.
Cuts through bone and flesh. Yeah, gets to the root.
Right. Sharper than a two-edged sword. All that. Living and active. Like we could do all day on how
the metaphor is there. It's clear.
It's a biblical metaphor, slightly updated, right? If you refuse to actually fight with it, you are doing a disservice to Scripture. And so you can sit there, you can teach on a Sunday, you can go through things, but if you do not apply it to what is actually happening among the people in front of you, you're doing something wrong. A good example of this is, so if you look in the book of Acts, if you look at the sermons in the book of Acts, those sermons, every single one of them, bar one, which is in Acts 10, that's the sermon to the Gentiles who are almost believers at that point. They just need nudged over the line, right? But every other sermon deals explicitly with a prevalent sin among the hearers. So in Jerusalem, you crucified Jesus. That's Acts 2. Yeah. You look later on at Stephen's sermon is just, that is all that's in there. It's just stiff-necked. Yeah. You look at Paul in Athens, he talks about their false gods, dealing with the issues that those people have very explicitly.
And the letters, same thing. Revelation, same thing.
So all of the epistles are dealing with an issue that the congregation is facing. And that doesn't mean you have to stand up every week and hit the same issue, because you've a spectrum of people there dealing with some different issues, right? But there are issues that we won't touch. We won't touch them in the name of, well, that's political, or, well, we don't want to put people off. We want them to feel welcome or comfortable or at home. And that is a failure of Christian duty as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, so you'd say we're called to analyze and critique culture to an extent?
We can't avoid doing so, because it is not just culture, it's spiritual. So spiritual warfare, so 2 Corinthians 10, it is, we take on arguments and every lofty opinion that sets itself up against the knowledge of Christ. So people go, oh, well, we don't want to be culture warriors. Well, sorry, culture is religion at large. That's what it is. You're dealing with ideologies, you're dealing with false gods, you're dealing with religious claims about the meaning of life, claims about the meaning of mankind, claims about morality. All of these things, they are innately religious, they are unavoidably religious. And if the world out there is worshipping some false god of some sort, the false god of self, the false god of self-identity, the false god of sexuality, whatever it might be, pick your poison. And you don't talk about it. You're saying we are just going to cede that ground to the enemy. we are just not doing warfare in
and you
that
get this
area.
creep of like advances of the opposing
Right.
side. Yeah.
And it also, so you're not evangelizing effectively. You're also not discipling effectively, because naturally when you live in a culture that is like that, those are the sins that start to creep in. And what does Paul say? Paul says a little leaven leavens the whole lump.
Right. Yeah.
So you let this thing take root in your church, and it starts off with, oh, it's not really, it's an issue out there, it's not an issue in here. But then, you leave it a decade,
Yeah.
and you've not touched any of these issues. And suddenly 30% of your congregation, generally the younger 30%, that have never heard anything about it and don't assume the same things that you assume, they are heavily compromised on these issues, or perhaps even totally compromised to the point of being activists in the other direction.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And you suddenly have a much harder time dealing with it.
Yeah.
It gets really to be like a big problem.
You have to unwind it. Go back.
I mean, you can destroy your church by not having dealt with it. So I give an example. I was chatting to BLM. Look, racism is obviously a sin, right? And so give all the caveats. Yada yada yada.
Right,
We know. We all know.
About that
Yeah,
before,
we all know, right? Okay, and so that's true. BLM was a Marxist organization built off the back of a lie, multiple lies, and
distortions of the truth.
Yeah, a whole bunch of exaggerations and actively anti-Christian, founded by people who were spiritualist. The idea of chanting "Say Their Name" was all about calling on the spirits of those dead people to come and help them. They've talked about all this publicly. This is not uncommon knowledge. Hate the nuclear family. Right. Demonic, like really, really evil. Like
it's because it's a common tool of the enemy to throw a load of things in with like this a kind of core good idea of justice, right?
Right. Yeah.
And obviously, God hates anyone that opposes or anyone that's oppressed. He relates, or God has a heart for the oppressed.
Sure.
And he opposes anyone who oppresses others. So there's like that the core truth. But then a million other things thrown in that are all evil.
Yeah. So, you've got it. So suddenly it's Black trans lives matter.
But the organization doesn't just stand for just saying that Black people matter,
right?
Because we all agree that.
Yeah, exactly. There's no one that disagrees with that term. Sorry, very, very, very few people, and anybody who did in the church would come up against serious opposition from other believers around them, right? But anyway, so that organization, terrible organization. I remember having a chat with a pastor of a big church who agreed with me basically on all of that. But he said, if we talk about that in public, if we say that in public, 90% of our congregation will leave. And I'm like, right, well, that's a problem.
Who's the shepherd in that situation?
Yeah, just a bunch of, and it's like, because you've never you've not taught your people to go against culture in any area. Like you what you said, you analyze your teaching for the last decade. We can go through it and go orthodox, yep. Like, sound, yep. Like not saying anything heretical, all of that. But you've not ever applied this to stuff that is actually happening in the wider world. You've never taken a stand on any of these issues. You've never talked about any of these, so take the other issues that are going on. Well, suddenly now you can't, because it's baked into your congregation that you don't do this, and to do so is unchristian, and actually we should just bow the knee to what's going on.
Do you think people are looking for pastors who do tackle these things?
Absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, my take on it is I actually think the pews are slightly more courageous than the pulpits a lot of the time.
Probably true.
Certainly in my experience, right? Now, I don't say that meaning that in every church and in every congregation that's going to play out well, and any pastor who just stands up one week not having done so. Like, if that guy had done that, 90% probably would have left, right? Probably wouldn't have been 90%.
Right.
Probably would have been 50. Right. But 50 is still a lot.
Yeah.
And when you've got staff and you've got a building and a mortgage, that's a problem. So I understand that that's difficult. But in general, what I've seen is churches that are taking a stand and that are not compromising and are happy to talk about issues up front, they do seem to be drawing a lot of people, more and more. I think there is a swing in that direction that I think is healthy. I think there's a few people who sorry, there are a few well-known people who put their heads up above the parapet early and took some flack, and more having done so since. Yeah. Probably a whole bunch of unknowns who did so early as well, and praise God for them. Yeah. I think we'll start to see churches go, no, actually we can talk about this, and there is,
and we have to.
We absolutely have to, but also I think there's an audience for it, which is not shouldn't be our standard, right? But human beings are wired to want to know truth. Yeah. To we're created in the image of God,
and people aren't as thick as they let on sometimes. Where I think a lot of people will, even when it comes to issues like talking about transgenders, I don't think that most people really believe that humans can be born in the wrong body and can have a I really don't genuinely think that most people buy into that, but I think it's the loving thing to do, and Christianity will have a very different idea of how to love people in that situation versus affirming just there. Sure. So it's like, to me, I think a lot of people really, it's kind of maybe this idea of like having this, maybe some people would say like the breath of God, or like something within us that recognizes the divine or like the creator, and it's, we recognize truth sometimes when we see it, but we kind of convince ourselves to not talk about it. But what was interesting is you said maybe 50% might leave that church. But I think over the 10-year span, more than that will leave the church anyway, because why would they go if you're just going to hear, like, at that point you're basically just getting, life wisdom or something. You can get that online. Why would you need to go to a church to hear just how to live well? And, people will find what they, more valuable teaching elsewhere. And if you're not getting it in church, they'll find it. And that's maybe something about online that's interesting, because people are searching out people like yourself that are talking about cultural issues, it's not being dealt with in their own home church. So it's kind of like a marker of our society that people maybe are more inclined to not speak up in person, but then like when they see it online, they're like, well, actually, I believe all this. I kind of wish it would be talked about more. So do you think it's if you were to look at maybe things that I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. So people will say about Christianity getting mixed up with politics. So how should our faith have a relationship with politics? Because people will say if you talk about homosexuality or BLM and that stuff, you're getting political. They'll automatically say that. But how would you respond to someone saying that, and how would you relate faith to politics?
Christians have no problem being political on the safe issues. Right? So no one ever says that when you talk about human trafficking, right? No one ever says that when you talk about racism from the other angle, right? No,
from a healthy angle,
a healthy angle. No, but even like the leftist angle as well. Like whenever BLM was happening, churches in the UK were falling over themselves to post black squares and do racial struggle sessions for a Sunday service, and I couldn't find a single one that didn't. So they'll do it for all of those. But they just won't do it on the ones where they get flack. So firstly, my number one pushback is going to be, okay, well, let's make sure we're not being total hypocrites here. Right? Because
don't pick and choose.
Yeah, like if you're happy to be political there, you should be political here too.
Yeah.
But slightly more, sort of to unpack it a wee bit further then, I suppose, politics is a subsection of culture. Right, and again, these things are religious at their core. So I think this is where people get it wrong.
Informed by a worldview.
Yeah. You everything has to make a religious claim. Every moral framework is religious. Politics. People say you can't legislate morality. You can only legislate morality. It is the only thing you can, is stealing wrong or not? Is murder wrong or not?
That's what we base our laws on.
Yeah, morality underpins legislation. Yeah. So politics is religious. So it's not that religion should not be political. It's actually a false dichotomy. Now, do I think that pastors should stand up on a Sunday and give like a full political manifesto?
Right.
Probably not.
Paisley style.
Yeah,
again, I do Northern Irish perspective.
Yeah, and I can't speak to Paisley specifically because I don't know enough about what he said, up front. Right, but do I want my pastor to sit there and analyze the newspaper every week? No, I don't. I think there's it's not the only thing that's going on, right? So the political is not the only part of culture that matters, but it is a part of culture that is important with the growth as well. So was it Carl Trueman? I think Carl Trueman made this point that we're all Marxists now in a way. And that is that we have accepted that politics has so much more reach into the wider world than it ever did before. So about half of our money goes to the government in some form or another. That's like half of your economic life. That's a really, really big, like everything. Politics has expanded so much from being a faraway bureaucracy, and you give them a few quid, and something happens, and there's a king, and whatever, and you might get called up to war, and you won't know what the war is about, and you have no input into it, but hey, that might happen. Yeah. Politics now impacts our media, it impacts what you can say to one another, it impacts what you're allowed to say in the public square. Like all of these things, politics has grown to such an extent that pretty much everything you do has an innately political angle to it. And so I reject the idea that we should avoid things because they're political. And the early church, by the way, got in trouble for being political. People think that the early church, they were just nice Christians doing a nice little Bible study, and for some reason the Roman emperor hated them and wanted to wipe them out. Yeah. That is such a, that's nonsense.
No, it went against the whole structure of society in many ways.
The way it worked was you had to show your allegiance to the emperor, and what you had to do was you had to offer a pinch of incense and say, Kaiser Kyrios, Caesar is Lord. And Christians went, we're not doing that because Caesar is not Lord, Jesus is Lord. We worship, we will honor the king.
Right.
But we're not going to worship the king. We're not going to add him in. We don't have Christ plus this other God here. And that was a political act, and that led to the persecution of Christians. So Christians have always been political and always been persecuted for their political stances. And so the fact that, for someone to say you shouldn't do that because that's political, flies in the face of the claims of Scripture. I mean, the writings of Paul about Jesus are very clearly taking on some of these claims that the Roman emperors made, right? They're very political writings.
Right. Use a lot of metaphors for things. I mean, even Jesus talking about things like giving to Caesar what's Caesar's and God what's God. Like that obviously was a statement sort of implying sort of the primacy there, or like of who's over who, and the relationship between that.
And no one ever seems to talk about in that, for instance, okay, well, so someone put it this way, well, you bear the image of God, right? So the coin bears Caesar's image, but people bear God's image. So there are things that Caesar is not. Jesus is very clearly saying he's not allowed to touch some of this stuff, right?
Yeah. He defines the parameters of a healthy relationship with government, really.
Yeah. You can pay your taxes. You should pay your taxes. You're not responsible for how those taxes are used, right? So you have a moral duty to pay that. But are there things that Caesar's not allowed to touch? Absolutely. So Jesus got in lots of trouble with politicians as well, and Jesus is very political in a lot of his interactions. So we sort of think, oh, well, what about Rome? Well, he was quite far away from Rome. He didn't have a problem calling Herod a fox, and he got into politics with them. But the Pharisees and Sadducees were the local political establishment. These were guys. These were guys that ran the show. The rich young ruler. Mm-hmm. That's not just some rich young guy. No. He is a politician.
Yeah, Nicodemus as a person.
Nicodemus. You got all of these. Jesus taking on the Sanhedrin. Like very political. Very political.
And Paul carried it on. The amount of people that he met.
Absolutely. So I think the idea that we shouldn't be touching politics. I think when you say that, you're saying, oh well. Jesus isn't really Lord of everything. That's pietism. That's saying he's Lord of the church. He's not Lord of what happens out there.
It's like saying that giving to Caesar what is Caesar's, and also giving to Caesar what is God's.
Right. We'll pay our taxes to Caesar, and we'll also give him the entirety of the society that we live in, except for this little fraction that we do on a Sunday morning.
And let the political government define our whole moral structure of society and the moral fabric of society. Yeah. So what can we do to respond then? So going forward, thinking pragmatically, what can the church then? We've sort of said about what we need to be maybe doing more of in terms of, or be involved in more. So what then, maybe the average person or even pastors, what would you like to see more of in terms of taking the initiative back?
Sure, yeah. So I think when it comes to what you can do, what someone can do as an individual or even a pastor, I think you want to shrink that change down, right, into something that's manageable. I think pastors need boldness to preach. And people say, well, is it courage or compassion? No, it's both.
Yeah.
You can't have, it's not compassionate to let someone mutilate their body and not say anything about it or whatever. Or take all of these issues. It requires courage, but it is compassionate. It's
or
not
if you know
neither
they're
or.
living in sin and it's going to harm their relationship with God, then you kind of have to say something.
Destroy your body, destroy your soul, destroy your eternity. Yeah, we love you enough to say something about that, even if you don't like it and you don't perceive it as compassionate. So I think pastors need courage. I think the average person should really be focusing on their circle of influence where they can. I think when it comes to voting, vote well, vote for candidates that are not anti-Christian. I think there are parties that it is a sin to vote for.
Okay. I'll give me a list.
The Democrats. No, I give you a list. I would happily give you a list. I think
Northern Ireland is very dangerous.
In Northern Ireland, pretty much anyone.
Pretty much.
You know, there's not many. But no, I think you're doing something wrong if you support that. I don't think you should give your vote to that as a Christian. I don't know how you can do it in good conscience.
What's tough is I've heard people say they're all bad, so why should I vote?
They're not all equally bad. They're
so
not all equally bad.
So it's better to go for the least worst candidate.
I think that's what voting is, and you don't have a moral obligation to vote. You can abstain. I don't think you have to.
My opinion is you have a moral obligation to have your say. So whether I would almost go out of my way to drive there and spoil my ballot, or at least even make a choice to not vote rather than just not voting out of laziness.
I agree. I think you should take it seriously, but it's also your vote is much more limited. Your ability to influence things through voting is, so I do think it's important, but I think it's much more limited than what you can actually do with your friends, your family, your local church, your local area. I think that's where most people should focus. I think a return to really focusing on your household, discipling the next generation, protecting them from a lot of the stuff that's out there. I think we've probably not done a great job of, a lot of people just let the internet disciple their kids. That's not good. Should not happen.
Or let the government disciple
or
their kids.
or the government. I think school system. I think in Northern Ireland we're blessed to still have a sort of semi-Christian influence there, diminishing.
But having worked in a Christian private school in America and seen what the public school system is like I understand why most, at least nearly the majority of people in my area have seriously consider or homeschool.
Yeah.
They're either really considering doing it or they do homeschool their kids. And then so would I, because even a Christian private school, there's only so much, we had a fantastic, environment for kids to grow up, but you can't, it's hard because you're trying to protect from so many outside influences. And to think back when I went to Grosvenor around the corner, it's, I just think of how wonderful my time in school was. Not that I was sheltered from anything. It's not a school where I saw plenty of stuff that my parents probably wouldn't have wanted me to see, but at the same time it was a kind of safe exposure to the world, versus in America where it's really it's terrible.
So I think you got to weigh that up on your local context to some extent. I mean, I'm personally our son's in P1, so first year of school. I'm happy to leave him in P1 to P3. I'm kind of okay with, and I know the school he's in. Once we get beyond that, I'll be seriously considering options. And I'm
can we homeschool here?
Yeah, you can homeschool. Okay. Yeah, you can do it there's again, this
you
is
don't
something
see people homeschool here.
They don't do it. It's not been as necessary in Northern Ireland because we've had a strong Christian influence. There's so many Christian teachers.
Sing hymns in school still
have assembly where you have prayer and the Easter story, and you've got some leftist who gets annoyed and everybody else is fine with it and it's like, right, whatever. So that does happen, but I think that's where focus should be. I think you should really go right. I have a circle that I can really influence here majorly. And I think by lots of us doing that, that's how you actually make a big difference down the road. So I think you vote wisely, but you also say, right, well, what can I impact? Well, I can impact my family, I can impact my church, I can support. One of the things I find really helpful in our church context is I never get better feedback, and the same would be true for Craig as senior pastor. I'm associate pastor. We never get better feedback than when we tackle something difficult. Like, people are so for it. So I did a sermon not long ago, maybe a year ago. I did one on transgenderism. You know, and like people were like brilliantly supportive. Like
they breathe a sigh of relief because they can talk about it.
Thank you for saying that. You know, if you support your pastor openly, publicly, or your church leadership, whatever your structure is, elders, minister, whatever, over things like that, it really does help. That makes a big difference. You don't need to know everything, but when you hear the truth and you go, that's truth that needs said. The similar one where like I preached on hell, and hell's not like an easy light topic, right?
Because people do, and again, especially here, the whole fire and brimstone kind of thing, it does have a negative connotation.
Yeah, but nonetheless, I thought we preached. I thought it was a good sermon. I thought it was not a. It was a serious one, but it wasn't to the point of just burning people to a crisp, right? It's like, this is really serious. Here's what Jesus says about it. What's going through Jesus. About it. Yeah. And again, really positive feedback. And as someone who's on the other side of that, that feedback is really, really helpful and encouraging, and it lets you know, okay, my people are for me. So I think people can make a difference. People can make a difference on that level. I think Christians should look at how they can get involved again on the local level. Is much easier to impact. So when I think about what I want to do, like if I could make a dent in the Northern Irish scene, I happen to get an audience from people across the wider world, a lot of Americans and stuff, and that's great. And we live in a globalized world. You got to deal with issues that are out there. It's not like you should just focus. Like if I just decided to talk about issues in Greater Belfast, that would really have a lot of traction. But nonetheless, where I want to see the actual on the ground impact would be here.
Right, yeah, because it's you can actually physically,
Belfast Northern Ireland as a whole, population 1.8 million. That's a large city. It's not. Can I impact the world? It's like, if I could impact this place in some way positively, if I can create space through what I'm doing to allow other pastors and church leaders to speak up on issues that maybe they wouldn't otherwise, or even create a sort of healthy pressure that they should talk about some of these things, and make it that they begrudgingly finally have to say something, because everybody's talking about it. There's this annoying guy on the internet that says these things, and someone's got to talk about it. I think that's a good thing, and so I think if you can look at change that way, you're probably more likely to accomplish it actually, and then that collectively means societal change.
Yeah, and I can't remember who it was, but someone said that Northern Ireland was going to be the last bastion of the gospel. I don't know whether Billy Graham or something. You might have said it too, but
I said that on Twitter recently.
I think, because I remember.
Did Billy Graham say it?
I think
me and Billy are agreed. There we go, King Billy.
I was just about to say, but I was thinking, I think it was McConnell, like James McConnell was doing that, that wild sermon thing that went crazy. Like the sermon was fun. I'm not going into it anyway. Not saying there's anything wrong with the sermon.
Good on you, James McDonald.
Yeah, there's nothing particularly wrong with what he was saying, but it was the one where he's on the Nolan show, because he was saying about Islam was evil.
Yep.
As a Christian, we're pretty comfortable. Like, that's a mainstream Christian perspective.
Yes, we're not pro-Islam.
Yeah, it doesn't mean everyone that follows it is like a terrible person.
Correct,
but we do agree that it's a perversion of our religion, really, our Jewish religion. Anyway, so I think he was talking about how, in that sermon, that was where I heard it was like Billy Graham or Spurgeon or one of these big sort of mainstream preachers said that Northern Ireland was going to be the last bastion of the gospel, and you might have said it too, but it's
literally said this the other week. Yeah, I didn't know they'd said that.
That's because we can perceive it. Like, we know for years it was the last place in the UK to have even abortion legalized, and that was out of our hands. Wasn't our decision.
Yep.
Gay marriage, same thing. We were the last to do that. So it's like the last place where these things are being given up.
So we have a history of this as well. Yeah. Right. So, like, I love the St. Patrick and the Irish Saints story, and so much of that did take place around the north. There's a long heritage back. A lot of those guys. Yeah. So St. Patrick,
Columba was based in the north.
Yep. Right. So you got Bangor Abbey. You've got all these ones that are around here. Or born around here or whatever, so I think there's something there. I'm a believer in that idea of, like, God likes things to rhyme. He does. He just he doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. Yeah. And I think there's something about
the heritage.
Our wee place has something on it that I believe is real, and I'm trusting God that, when Europe fell before there was something came out of here. I'm hoping it'll be the whole of Ireland as well.
Yeah.
I'm believing for the guys down there to see something happen. I mean, there's even this. I mean, so there's this prophecy that St. Patrick gave. Again, now, knowing how legitimate these things are, I'm not 100% sure, but he has this vision towards the end of his life where he sees Ireland and it's all ablaze, and then it gets darker and darker and darker and darker, and the fire goes out and it dims, except for this little sort of slight ember burning up in Uli, which is east of Northern Ireland, basically eastern half of the from the Ban, and then suddenly it starts to grow, and then that whole island comes back to life. And like, I think that could happen.
Yeah.
I'm believing for that, and I do think
Yeah.
I think we see it, like the amount of people here who go to church, who profess Christian faith, is so much higher.
Very unique.
Yeah, and I think we've been reasonably, at least in the church, I think there's something stronger here than I've seen elsewhere. Pulpits are a bit stronger. Believers are more like, yep, let's go for it. And we've seen, like, it's been really cool the last 2 months for us as a church. We were sitting under about 200. We're not a massive church, right? In Craigavon, we've got a terrible building, like a converted office, and it's like we do the best with it, but it's just the way it is. We were under 200 for ages, like few years. Last 2 months we've been at like 250, 260, 270. We had 300 there on Easter Sunday, and a lot of these are people that are like exploring the faith. Like, there's something happening. So I believe Northern Ireland has. I know this is probably not going to Northern Ireland, but you should move here. Right? This is the place to be.
People that I've been speaking to, even Heather's family, like there's even people that have seen here in person. There is something unique, and I would really struggle with the weather coming back here from Florida, honestly.
I'm sure.
That's a big thing,
it's
but
brutal.
It's nice to be able to go out to your back garden and have sun nearly every day, and that I would really miss that. But at the same time, there's a culture here that's really hard to replace. And I was just going to say, if we're the last bastion of the gospel, I think we're doing all right, but we could be doing even better. And for all that, like, even coming back here, I remember I struggled to find a really good, faithful church community. I tried a few places and it was all right, but it's tough sometimes to find like just a good church that's really like ticking the boxes, and not everyone will have different boxes, but I think we can be doing what we can be, tackling culture and from a better way, like you're saying. We can be worshiping in better ways, or like bringing sort of even the gifts like we were talking about, bringing that into church more. So there's a lot of improvement, but I think we could be a really exceptional place if we can nail some of those things.
Totally agree. Like that is my like burden. It's like we've got there is an opportunity here. I think there's the blessing of some of this stuff is baked into our culture. And we do have also a critical mass of believing Christians that can make a dent.
Right.
And so
can turn the tide.
Can. Not saying definitely will, but could. Hypothetically, it's so much more of an opportunity here than it would be in the mainland or most of Western Europe.
Let's speak it out. They will make a change.
They will, absolutely. I'm believing that. But that carries with it a responsibility. The church needs to go, we are in a unique position. If we don't fight, we're actually wasting one of those multi-talent opportunities that God gives you. So let's do something with it and not be scared.
Awesome. Well, let's finish by, you want to share where people can find you, how they can connect with you, how they can, like, even your church if you want to go that way.
Sure,
like, just tell people all about you and what.
Great, yeah. So just search my name. So Americans, Jamie Bambrick. Jamie. For Northern Irish,
Jamie Bambrick.
I wouldn't say that to anybody other than those who don't understand the accent. So Jamie Bambrick. So on YouTube and on Twitter, and you can check out Hope Church in Craigavon. That's where I am part of the team there. I'm blessed to be part of that. And other than that, in terms of following me, you can come to Belfast and just sort of like lurk in the background. You can follow me that way. That'd be, I mean, don't please, but
just follow you around.
That's the only other way to do so. Actually, I've started Instagram as well. No one really follows me on Instagram. But I was like, I had a few people ask, so I was like, I might as well put the content over there. So Instagram too.
Instagram's great. Yeah, it's great, but it's bad, but it's great. You can if you use it right. And then do you want to mention about the conference then?
Sure, yeah. I'm going to be at a TP USA event out in Florida.
Yeah.
West Palm Beach though, so not quite where you're at.
Yeah.
But I assume
all the best people are out there.
Yeah.
Although that kind of goes against everything we were just saying. But anyway.
Yeah. Aside from Florida is the Northern Ireland of America.
Correct.
Can we say that?
I think we can strongly say that.
Yeah, great.
It's the corner with a little bit of rationality still left in it.
Sweet. So we'll be out there in late July. Actually, if anyone's out that way, I'm happy to extend by a day or two to kind of do something. If there's a church out there, I'd be happy to meet up with someone or do like a evening or a small group or whatever. That'd be cool. So awesome. That's me.
All right, well, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in to watch, as always. I hope you enjoyed like a little bit of a different flavor this week with more Northern Irish issues, and maybe if some of the Americans are watching, it's might be stuff that you aren't familiar with, but thanks for tuning in regardless, and hopefully you got something useful out of that. But that's all for this week. Thanks again, and hope to see you again soon on the 2 things you shouldn't talk about.